So we've got a lot of people on here. I think we're gonna go ahead and start because we have a lot to cover today. My name is Frances Kunreuther. I'm going to be hosting this fabulous book launch today. We are so excited to be here to celebrate and to talk about Deepa Iyer's latest book that just came out. If you don't know, this is her second book called Social Change Now, a guide for reflection and connection. So as we get started, I just want to thank you for joining us and introduce Deepa, who is the Senior Director of Strategic Initiatives here at the Building Movement Project. And she'll be in conversation today with Alicia Sanchez Gill, the Executive Director of the Emergent Fund. My name, as I said it before, is Frances Kunreuther, and I'm co-executive director of the Building Movement Project, which is a national nonprofit that supports social change and social justice within the nonprofit sector and with movement building organizations by conducting research, developing resources, and building relationships with groups on the ground. So I'll be moderating today's discussion. I'm really excited about that. You can put your questions or comments in the chat or the Q&A. And I just want to pause to introduce Wing T. Tran-Meyer and Jasmine Leeward, who will be helping us today. They've helped design the webinar. They're doing the tech behind the webinar. So just join me in thanking them, because what you don't see is what's really happening here today. And I want to acknowledge their help, presence, in making this possible. So before we begin, let me introduce Deepa and Alicia a little bit more formally. Deepa builds projects, resources, and narratives that support organizations and individuals engage in transformative movements for progressive social change. Over the past 2 decades, Deepa has played many roles: weaver, frontline responder, storyteller, and guide. And if you don't know what those mean, you're going to find out in the next hour. Her political and community homes include Asian American, South Asian, Muslim, and Arab ecosystems, where she spent 15 years in policy advocacy and coalition building in the wake of the September 11th attacks and the ensuing backlash. Currently, Deepa leads projects on solidarity and social movements here at the Building Movement Project and hosts the Solidarity Is This podcast. And I just listened to the last episode. It's fabulous. I highly recommend it. I also want to extend a very warm welcome to Alicia Sanchez Gill, who is the Executive Director of the Emergent Fund. In her role, Alicia has raised and moved millions of dollars to Black, Indigenous, and people of color-led grassroots organizations. Her passion is ensuring that those on the front lines have the resources they need to build power and transform communities. Prior to the Emergent Fund, Alicia spent 15 years in gender justice organizations working on local and national campaigns to end interpersonal and state patriarchal violence, with abolition as a North Star. So welcome, Alicia and Deepa. So Deepa, I want to get started with you. Maybe you could just share what inspired this book. How did it come about? And we're so glad to be hosting this and hear the background.
Thank you so much, Frances. It is so wonderful to be here. Before I answer your question, I just want to take a moment to say some thank yous. The book has pages of acknowledgements in it, but I want to specifically mention you, Frances, Sean, and the entire BMP family, both past and present, that I've had the fortune of working with and learning from. It's a real privilege. And Alicia, my gratitude to you. You were one of the first people to really resonate with this framework, and your enthusiasm for it helped me to deepen and expand it. Finally, this book would not be out in the world without the collaboration of Thick Press and Omnivore, as well as the many people in my ecosystem who have been supporting me and continue to do so. So Frances, to answer your question, this book and the framework that it's premised on is really the result of 3 questions that I've been grappling with for a decade or so. And I'll simplify those as inquiries around I, we, and us. So I myself am at heart a frontline responder, and I've played that role in the wake of 9/11, which you alluded to, as well as many of the other crises that have occurred in our communities since then. And I'm not the only one, I'm sure. And so I've often wondered how we as people and organizations can be effective when we're constantly caught up in a cycle of crisis. And this framework speaks to some strategies to address that and break out of it. So to move from the I to the we, another inquiry that I sit with often is how a lot of our spaces, nonprofits, task forces, social justice movements, hold the values of connection and solidarity very dear to us. And yet in reality, our work is often siloed and isolated. So how can we deepen interdependence and reciprocity in our ecosystems is another question that I've sat with. And then from the we to an even bigger us, as we know, a lot of people care about social change, but in many ways, our actions are reactionary or reflexive or time-bound, say to the uprisings in 2020 or the presidential election. I've often wondered how we can create sustainable pathways for people who don't work full-time in nonprofit and movement spaces to feel connected to social change. And so this framework provides ideas for those pathways. So these are the three inquiries, the I, the we, and the us, that I kept going back to again and again over the past decade. And so this framework is an approach to tackle those questions. And when I put it out there in 2017 in an article on Medium, I really did not think that it would speak to many people beyond those in the nonprofit sector, but it has, particularly during the pandemic, the uprisings, and the political cycle we're in. And so over the last couple of years, I've taken this framework into Zoom rooms almost every week since the pandemic began, and I've learned a lot from those trainings and workshops. And so it just emerged that a workbook with journal prompts and real life examples and ideas for application just seemed like the right next step to support people and groups that are engaging in social change. So this is my humble contribution to the already vibrant and vast landscape of ideas about social change movements and leadership, and I hope that it will be useful to you. So I'll turn it back over to you, Frances.
Well, I just want to say, having been part of your presentations, how important they've been. And as you point out in the book, we're moving through overlapping crisis, especially at this time. And the book's been really a roadmap for people and organizations engaging in social change. And I remember you wrote about this in the beginning of the book, and I thought maybe you could just read a little bit just to share that language that you used in the book.
Yes, I would love to do that. It is a virtual book talk. Okay. So I will read a little bit from the beginning of the book to set this up. It's called The Time Is Now. My friend Kevin Fong, who is a healer and a weaver, once shared a story with me about Grace Lee Boggs, a Detroit-based Asian American activist and scholar. At the start of community meetings, Grace would begin with a question: what time is it on the clock of the world? When I reflect on that question, I often have the palpable and sometimes urgent feeling that the time is right, the time is ripe, and the time is immediate for social change. We're living through a time that demands our attention and requires our consistent action. People around the world are confronting wars, climate disasters, and economic inequity at unprecedented levels. Here in the United States, we face an almost daily barrage of attacks and restrictions on the rights, bodies, and livelihoods of people. The violent insurrection at the US Capitol came on the heels of a polarizing presidential election that followed 4 years of bans, walls, and raids against communities. The global pandemic has exposed the weaknesses of public systems and institutions that we have long relied upon, from education to housing to public health. The visible presence of white nationalist groups is spurring fear. Transgender youth feel unsafe in schools and on streets. Climate change is a continual threat to everyone on the planet. As I finalize this guide, we are in the midst of a 6-week period that includes the massacre of Black people at a supermarket in Buffalo, a school shooting in Uvalde, Texas, that killed young children and teachers, an economic crisis leaving many people unable to pay their monthly bills, homelessness and mental illness related to the pandemic, and the evisceration by the United States Supreme Court of the right of people to make reproductive choices. The time on the clock of the world is right now. In workshops and trainings, I often ask people to reflect on their state of readiness to engage with these issues. The responses are very similar and usually include the following: We feel overwhelmed, frustrated, and confused. We find ourselves on a seesaw, lurching between numbness and outrage. The ways that we have always responded are no longer sufficient or effective. We're not sure what to say or how to step in. We expect more from our organizations and community leaders, but feel disappointed and heartbroken at times. And I also hear more. Even as people bear weary witness to the emergencies and crises swirling around them, they're connecting and they're learning. People are aligning around shared values and goals, recognizing that entrenched power structures and inequitable systems can no longer be part of our status quo. More and more of us are acutely realizing that issues of justice, equity, and solidarity cannot be denied, dismissed, or delegated to others alone. These issues have become our business. They're everyone's responsibility. Being part of social change is one of the most important ways we can connect with each other at a time when society insists upon compartmentalizing us into silos of identity, thought, political alignment, and geography. When we engage in social change, we resist these silos and we choose connection and solidarity. This book provides a roadmap for people and organizations in various stages of engagement with social change. I'll stop there.
It just gives me chills. You're such a beautiful, beautiful writer, Deepa.
That means a lot coming from you, Frances.
So Alicia, I'd love to bring you into the conversation. So you heard about what inspired Deepa to write the book. You've read this already and you heard it again this morning. From your vantage point, where you sit in supporting movements, what comes up for you?
Thanks so much, Frances. Thank you, Deepa. I have heard this, I've read it, I've heard you talk about this tool over and over again. And I just have to say, I never get tired of it. Every time you speak, I'm like re-inspired. I learn again, I learn more deeply. So just really grateful and honored that I can even be a part of this conversation. So Deepa, you talked a lot about solidarity and silos. And I think that that's what's really coming up for me in this moment. I think that so often in our organizing work, often in our nonprofits, even in our communities, you talked about isolation. In our work, in our roles within organizations, we're isolated in our communities and certainly exacerbated by the pandemic. We are more and more isolated than ever. And I think that this tool is this book is such a beautiful reminder that we don't do the work alone. We don't do work, we don't organize alone, we don't build community alone, we don't enact social change alone. And it's such a helpful reminder for all of the different, like the varying ways that we can bring our skills and gifts and really plug in to the rich ecosystem of change that is already happening. And so I feel constantly inspired by all of the shifts that we're seeing. And with all of the horrible things that we are bearing witness to, I also feel like there's such a hope by the amount of change that is happening and the amount of people that are plugging in all of these various roles. The other thing that I'm thinking about as a person who comes from organizing, but is now working in philanthropy, where we're moving resources to the folks who are doing this work on the front line. And I might talk a little bit more about this later, but I just want to say too that philanthropy in itself is also an ecosystem, right? And we are moving resources to ecosystems. And so I think that one thing that really comes up for me as a person who's working within the funding space is also to really think about how we fund, as thinking about not just funding organizations or individuals, but thinking about funding within the context of ecosystems and really moving resources to whole organizing ecosystems to reduce this sense of isolation and scarcity and competition that sometimes shows up.
Love those comments,
Yeah.
Alicia, and they really resonate. Deepa, it just occurs to me that people may not be familiar with this work, and maybe you could talk about the social change ecosystem framework and how the book really builds on that framework.
Yes, I would be happy to do that. So I think that I want to start off, and I know that we're going to be putting up this deck where you can see some of the slides. So, the bottom line, right, is that this is a framework that is a tool. It's a resource. It's for individuals and organizations to use in order to become more effective in engaging in social change. And it's got 3 steps, and I'll quickly go over those. So the first is that it's an opportunity for us to identify and align around shared values. And that's what you see in that middle circle. We've written some values in there that are important at our organization. It would depend on, what your shared goals are and your shared values are. The second is to get really clear about the role or roles that we can play as individuals or organizations, depending on the context, our skills, and our capacity. The framework invites us to think about 10 roles that people and groups most commonly show up as. And as you'll see, the roles are not job titles. They reflect actually the ways in which we show up with our skills and our strengths. And then the third component of this framework is that it invites us to strengthen the broader ecosystem. It is, visually a circle, right? So it engages us, it helps us think about the connections that we can build with others who might be playing different roles in service of a broader vision. So those are the 3 different components of this framework. And if you work through the book, you'll be able to actually move through values, ecosystems, and roles. And on the next slide, we can see some of the benefits of using the framework on this slide here. And so what can we gain from using this framework? So first and foremost, it's a multidimensional framework. So you can use it as an individual, you can use it as an organization, or you can use it as a network, a task force, even a movement. So one of the first things is that the framework is really all about values-based systems change, right? It isn't just about, okay, I'm a disruptor, and so I'll show up at a rally. It's really about asking, to what end will I play this role? How am I helping others in that ecosystem? What will change as a result in terms of a system or a policy by me playing this role? Another benefit from using this tool is it invites us to think about the infrastructure that we need in our sector, in our work, in order to do our work better. So what are the partnerships, the collaborations, and structures that our ecosystem needs to deepen relationships and do our work effectively? So one example is that these roles, as you probably already intuited, are pretty complementary and collaborative, right? So for example, if you show up as a visionary, where you're seeing sort of the North Star and you're inspiring people, visionaries are more effective, or I say most effective, if they're actually working with builders and experimenters who are kind of creating the scaffolding between the reality and that North Star. Or say frontline responder organizations with frontline responder staff really need to think about building an infrastructure that includes caregivers to help sustain those frontline responder staff, right? So it invites us to think about the support systems we need to put in place. A third benefit is that it keeps us accountable around our privilege and power. So as we think about how we show up, is there a role that we consistently and constantly play? Would we do well if we actually mentored other people into that role? I often think about this particularly around the role of the disruptor, which is really about getting into good trouble, as Representative John Lewis asked us to do. And oftentimes people of color are the ones that play this disruptor role. And I would challenge folks, especially folks who have race privilege, white folks, to really think about playing this disruptor role in terms of disrupting ideas or conversations or policies that would actually enable the entire ecosystem to move forward. And then finally, a final benefit is that this framework can help us think about our sustainability and well-being. We can't play all these roles, right? And so sometimes an aha moment that people will have when they work with this is they'll say, wow, I'm carrying like 8 of these roles. No wonder I am exhausted. So it helps us think about how we want to switch roles. And a quick example I'll give is, I mentioned earlier that I often have played the role of the frontline responder. And I learned, probably a little bit too late, that that role was not sustainable for me. And more recently, I've sort of moved into playing the role of a guide who actually works with and mentors and supports other frontline responders. And so there is a way here to stay in our ecosystem. We don't have to leave. We don't have to be canceled out. This is a framework that enables us to actually find and switch roles depending on context, depending on our strengths and our skills. So I will pause there.
Thanks so much. And I just really appreciate what's coming up in the chat, how people are seeing this, asking for support for ways to use this in your own work, and also thinking broadly about how none of us can do everything, that we're interdependent, as you said. And that's the beauty of it, that we are, not only are we interdependent, but we also need to make room for other people to come into the movement and not, hoard the roles. It's like, you don't want role hoarding. And so both pay attention to ourselves and what's happening. Alicia, you've used this framework in your work. You've used it in your personal leadership journey. So will you talk a little bit about how it's benefited you and the organizations you've worked with?
Yeah, I just want to echo Frances and Deepa. Thank you so much. Some of the things that are coming up in the chat, something that I wrote down as folks were talking in the chat and as Deepa was talking, is just that this idea that we are like deeply committed to being in relationship with each other. Something else that I wrote in the chat was that this ecosystem reduces this sense of hierarchy. Often when we're thinking about how we enact change, it's in the context of like a job or a role within a nonprofit. And so I think what's really beautiful about this ecosystem is this can happen in all kinds of like different varying ecosystems, whether that's your organizing collective, a mutual aid group, your job, or any other place. I've used it for myself. I journal about this. It's also been really fascinating to see how I show up in different places. In Deepa's original tool in 2017, one of the things that it asks, and I'm probably paraphrasing Deepa, so correct me if I'm wrong, is like, does this role actually spark joy for you? Or have you been placed into this role? Maybe it wasn't spark joy, but you know what I mean. Or have you been kind of placed or pigeonholed into a role that actually doesn't work for you and actually is like very depleting? And so one of the things that's been really helpful for me to use as an individual is just to think about how I show up in these varying roles. For example, I too have often been a frontline responder. And I joke that I started my career working at a rape crisis center, and now I run a social justice fund that resources Black, Indigenous, and people of color organizers who are working on the front line of the myriad of crises that we're facing in this moment. And so in many roles in my life, I have played frontline responder, but I've also been a builder. I've also been a visionary. I've also been an experimenter, and it kind of depends on the context and the role that is being required of me. It also has been helpful to use. I've used it with boards. I've used it with volunteers. It's a really helpful tool to think about who is missing from our ecosystem, right? Like, so if I'm a visionary, but I don't have any builders, I have a lot of ideas, right? And no one to implement or no one to brainstorm with, right? If I'm a storyteller, but I'm telling stories that can be deeply traumatic, and I'm doing that without the context of healing and caregiving, is the story, like, to what end am I telling this story, right? And so I think that it's really important as you're thinking about the kind of ecosystem that you're a part of, to remember too, that all of these roles have value. All of the folks who are playing these roles have value, right? And there's no hierarchy to these different roles, and that they are all in service of like equity and our collective liberation. And so I think for me, it's been really helpful to use this as like a tool in building teams, in building community, in building networks. I've just found it incredibly, incredibly helpful to think about for my own self-awareness, and then for the awareness of groups that I'm a part of. The other thing that I'll say is just that I do think sometimes, Deepa, you talked a little bit about like power and privilege, and I think that there are some ways in which some roles may be kind of, you name this around disruptors, but are very racialized and gendered, right? And so I think that there's also a way in which it's important to like just notice and name, like, who is constantly showing up as the caregivers in your life, right? Is it always women of color who are playing caregivers in your life, right? Is it always white folks who are considered visionaries, and like, what is the power dynamic dynamic around that too. So I think that this can be really helpful also in thinking about group power dynamics.
Wow, I love all those points from, how the current power structure plays out within the social change map, and then how to value everything and to really understand how those roles are being assigned even, or how you're self-assigning those roles. So really wonderful. Deepa, a lot of people and organizations are interested in the roles and in the framework. And obviously we want people to get the book because it really goes in to a very deep dive on the various characteristics of the roles, and really has a lot of reflection space for people who have the book and for people reading the book. But Deepa, I wonder if you could just share examples of how these roles are played out by individuals, but also by organizations. As Alicia said, she used it personally, but she also used it in organizational settings.
Yes, absolutely. And Alicia, just wanted to really co-sign what you said about the gendered and racialized roles that oftentimes people are asked to play, and to be aware of that. So yes, I would love to talk a little bit about the multidimensional use of this framework. And for that, we're going to take a look on your screen. You should be seeing sort of a larger image of the framework, a poster size image with the roles and characteristics. And my colleague Wing T is just going to be zooming in, so you can, maybe we could just show, some of the different roles and the characteristics, like storytellers. So, there are different characteristics here, but if you, took a dive into this book, you would find a lot more in terms of what are the ways in which we can grow in these roles, how can we support roles, and how organizations play these roles. And so to that end, with organizations, organizations and movements or task forces, campus associations, wherever you work that is an ecosystem, right, or you connect to, you could use this framework to understand assets and strengths, redundancies, as well as gaps. So one example I'll provide, from the work that Wing T and I do at BMP is the work that we do with a table called the Asian American Leaders Table, which is a coalition of local and national groups that came together at the start of the pandemic to address the increase in incidences of harassment and violence targeting Asian Americans. And in this coalition, as we map out that ecosystem, we can already see how different organizations play various roles. So one of the first things that this ecosystem or table did was to align around shared values. So in the middle of the circle of the map, you could see some of those. And so for this particular table, it was around community safety. But I want to make a point that we're not always aligned. And I think it's important to think about, what does it look like when there is conflict when it comes to values? What does it look like when we don't agree, which is absolutely inevitable? And how do we sort of stay in what I have learned from Black movement leaders? How do we stay in and recognize generative conflict, right? What are the conditions for generative conflict around values? So this table, thinks about values, but beyond that, we also know that different organizations play various roles. So for example, the Asian Law Caucus, which brought this table together and brings it together each month for meetings, coordinates a listserv, it really plays the role of a weaver. It connects groups together. It sees the through lines between the various issues that the groups are working on. And it has this big picture sense of what everyone's doing. So it keeps us connected as the weaver. Another organization in the table, Suru for Solidarity, which really works with and addresses issues around incarceration, and really stems from Japanese American community members and their experiences. They play the role of a healer. And so they often create space for community circles and dialogues to explore the impact of generational trauma carried by Asian Americans. And that's really what healers do. They're sort of looking at the higher level of how trauma winds itself through our communities and organizations, and how to address that. We often don't have healers in our ecosystems. And so that's one, I'm really grateful for Suru for playing this role. And then, of course, with this particular table, because it's focused on responding to incidences of violence and harassment, there are a lot of groups that play the frontline responder role, like the Sikh Coalition or the Asian American Federation and others, to provide wraparound legal support, mental health support, and the like. So you can see here just from this example that mapping an ecosystem like this can really reveal where are our assets so we build power, where are our redundancies so we get more effective, and where are our gaps so that we diversify this robust ecosystem. So you could use this tool to map out your own ecosystem in this way, and get it stronger and more effective. And as someone said earlier, philanthropy too is an ecosystem, right? And so whatever ecosystem you're working in, you could potentially use this framework to map it out.
So that actually leads me to a question for you, Alicia. But before I ask the question, we're going to go into a Q&A soon. So if you have some questions, I know a couple of you have already put questions into the chat or into the Q&A, but if you have some questions for Deepa and Alicia, please let us know and we'll try to answer them. So Alicia, Deepa just mentioned, how funders could use this framework. So what are your thoughts on that? How could that diversify their grantee ecosystem, or any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, Deepa, when you said we don't have healers in our ecosystem, I was like, oh, shoot. It's so true, right? I think that often in philanthropy, and if there are other folks in philanthropy, please drop it in the chat. Philanthropy can often have a lot of control over these kinds of ecosystems, I think in a couple of ways. One, by setting the agenda around what is important in the moment, which then creates this system where grantees and nonprofits and organizations feel like they are trying to fit their work into a funder's new priorities, right? And so if a funder says today we are focused on climate justice, tomorrow we're focused on gender justice, next week we'll be focused on racial justice, right? As if those things aren't connected in their own ecosystem, right? But that often creates this scramble from folks on the front lines to fit their work into whatever a funder's new priorities are. Right, and that can really disrupt our movement ecosystems. I think one of the other things that happens often in philanthropy is that philanthropy gets a couple of groups that they really love, like a couple of movement darlings, right? And they only fund the work that they see as valuable. And again, that's often racialized and gendered, right? So we don't see healing justice work as valuable, right? We want to see disruptors, we want to see direct action, we want to see frontline responders, but storytelling is incredibly important to our movements and creating solidarity, as Deepa has already said, right? Caregiving and healing is important. Mutual aid is important to our work. It's important to our survival. After funding disappears, all we have is each other, right? And all we have is solidarity, and all we have is our ecosystem. And so I think that for funders, as we are looking at this ecosystem too, we might want to think, where are the gaps in grantees, right? So we're funding a ton of frontline responders, but are we funding enough storytelling, right, to actually shift the cultural story about what we are trying to progress? Are we funding enough healing? Are we funding the building, like the movement infrastructure, the under the mycelium of our movements, right? Are we actually funding the builders in our work? No, we're always funding visionaries, right? Or we're always funding kind of the big and showy organizations. And so I think that for philanthropy too, this is an opportunity to reflect on where our resources are being distributed and kind of what we are underfunding in the ecosystem. And so I think this is an incredibly helpful tool for us. And then in addition to that, like not just external, but also within our organizations, right? Emergent Fund is made up of a bunch of organizers ourselves, right? So our entire organization is like folks of color and Indigenous folks who come from movement space. But even within that, we probably have a lot of healers and maybe some frontline responders, and maybe we don't have enough storytellers or guides. We have Deepa, so that's wonderful. Deepa is a guide. And so, even within our philanthropic organization for Emergent Fund, I think that there is also some practice around figuring out like, who is it that's missing? Like, what roles are missing from our own ecosystem? One thing that I do think that like philanthropy could be more clear about is that central core theme of like equity, liberation, justice, and solidarity, and just really also making sure that the funding that we're doing in the ecosystem is getting us towards this shared vision of equity, liberation, justice, and solidarity, or whatever the priorities are for our organization. Because sometimes we say we care about these things, but then we're still funding 97% white-led organizations. We're still funding, we're not funding trans and queer Black-led organizations. We're not funding undocumented folks, right? So is our funding actually aligned with what we say we want to do? And I think that this is a really great tool to kind of make sure that we're aligned.
Thank you so much. And just want to double click on everything that you've been saying and how important it is to be critical, have a critical lens, but also have a wide lens. And both things can be there, an embracing lens and a critical lens of current funding. So we have a couple of questions. I wanted to start with one, which is how does this framework account for those? This is from Helen, who hold power, especially power that has funding, because we're talking about philanthropy within a specific ecosystem. And some of it is about volunteering, but also I've noticed a lot, there's some groups that get lots of funding and then some groups get like a little trickle of funding, and some people are just volunteering or activists within their own communities. So I would love to ask both of you, how do you think about how the power dynamics within an ecosystem, which always exist, right?
Yeah, I can start with that. I feel like Alicia made some great points from the philanthropic end. I think that one of the things that we also don't spend a lot of time doing when we create, task forces or tables is actually take the time to talk about our community agreements. We talk about sometimes things like, leave your phone out or take care of your needs. Really important. But what about, for example, how do we handle conflict when it emerges? How about, what does it mean to be on a learning journey as individuals and collectively? How will we actually be aware of power and privilege and when it shows up, and how will we deal with it? So I think taking some time to go through and set some of those community agreements, and as Alicia mentioned, spend some time thinking about the values and really understanding what the words mean, because I think that many of them, I do a lot of work on solidarity and it's a buzzword, right? And so what does it actually mean? Spending more time on that because we're so concerned with, and we should be, because there are a lot of urgent issues out there that need to be addressed. We're so concerned with sort of the goal of this campaign and what we're going to win. So we often say that how we do the work is just as important as what the work is. And so spending a little bit more time on the how and coming back to it and revisiting it could help us course correct, because we all make mistakes and errors, and to also think about doing it better the next time around. So that is one way to address some of those power dynamics as well.
Mm-hmm. Can I just add to this, Deepa? I just think that course correction, that's a place where experimenters can really show up, right? Like the folks who within our organizations, within our networks, within our ecosystems, who can help us iterate. I think too, that part of that like sense of moving through this like community building and this ecosystem, like the development of our shared values, is often because people feel like because we are in crisis that we don't have time to slow down, right? And so I think that what is also really important is to hold that while like, yes, there's some really important work that needs to happen, the urgency is in building relationships with each other, right? Like the campaign will happen, but like we have to be in community and we have to be in relationship with each other, and outside of this sense of like constant kind of manufactured urgency, because that's what they want. Like they don't want us to be in community with each other, right? And so so I think that like, yeah, that this sense of like moving in a lot of urgency can also feel in conflict with taking time to build relationship with each other.
And just want to say there's some great additions in the chat about this topic. I just want to do one follow-up because it's related to what you've been saying, but Julius asks how the framework applies to diversity, equity, and inclusion spaces. And we know that a lot of organizations are focused on this, but they don't have the ecosystem map. And I thought we could merge that before we moved on to some other questions. It seems like a good follow-up.
Yeah, sure. So it can absolutely be used in spaces that are looking at diversity, equity, and inclusion. If those are sort of your shared values, I would recommend really leaning into what those words mean, though, because again, they've gotten used a lot. And then in terms of if you are part of an institution that's looking at this, right, and you're just starting out, this framework might be useful because you could utilize it to understand what are the different roles that individuals or departments are going to play in order to advance DEI. And so, for example, what are the builders going to do, right? How are they going to evaluate the work? What are the ways in which, and I love that Alicia has brought up experimenters a lot, because I think we're in this space, but we don't talk about innovation a lot. But what are the ways in which experimenters can push out of the status quo, right? We don't all, yes, we all have the DEI statements, and that is great. That is the vision, but what kinds of new things can experimenters suggest for us to try out that maybe have not been tried before? We want to think about how we tell the story. So oftentimes when I work with groups, they'll say, well, we're doing all this amazing work on DEI or whatever the issue is, but nobody really understands it, which then means that we need some storytellers in the mix, right? So how do we build the narrative? How can that narrative be replicated? Who are we speaking to? How do we make it accessible for folks to understand? So those are just some examples of how you can map out a robust, fill out a robust ecosystem that comes together where folks understand their roles, but are also supporting each other in terms and challenging each other in terms of advancing towards those roles.
Alicia, anything to add?
I just joked in the chat that we say the same. We're like, oh, we're doing cool work. I don't know if we're telling the story. Huh. Maybe we need more storytellers, right? So even for me as a person who's seen this, read the book and used the tool over and over again, and like I'm constantly being reminded of, and it's not like not that there are gaps necessarily, but there's just so much space and opportunity for like brilliant people who share our values to be a part of our community. And so there's some places where we could probably use some storytelling about our own work at Emergent Fund. So thanks for that reminder, Deepa.
I wanted to just move a little bit because there's been so much in the chat about educators. And I know that it's something you've thought about, and talking from very young children through post-secondary education. And just curious from both of you how you see the social change map being used in this book, especially how educators could use the book.
Yeah, so Alicia and I are both parents. Alicia has a younger child, mine is 12, but I feel like this tool can be useful in a lot of different ways. One of the most rewarding things about this framework has been hearing from kindergarten teachers and first grade teachers who say that they're using this framework to talk to young children about understanding the roles that people play in their community or their school, to not just be caregivers, but to be visionaries, and also to encourage young children to play these roles, to think about themselves in this way, and to think about their broader community. So parents can do that, teachers can do that. Another way it can be used is, and I think someone may have mentioned this, I feel like I read really quickly, someone was using this in their Asian American history class. You could use this in classes to talk about different figures in history. So I actually used this tool to talk to my son Ahi about understanding the ecosystem that developed to advance the march, the Selma March, right, around voting rights. And so we read about using the Zinn Education Project and Teaching for Change's materials. We read about all the different people who were part of that. And then I would ask him, what role is that person playing here, right? And so we built out a map of all those folks to help understand that it took everyone coming together and playing these different roles in extraordinarily difficult circumstances in order to make that march happen, and how it was part of the broader civil rights struggle. And then, I think that, so it can be used by parents and caregivers, it can be used by teachers, it can be used in college classes. And so I think there are a lot of different ways in which educators can incorporate it. And I would love to partner, collaborate, learn about your ideas in doing that and taking it further. Alicia, do you want to add on to it?
No, that was so comprehensive, Deepa. I have a 20-month-old, but already it's like fun to watch your children step into, toddle into, crawl into roles that are feeling right for them. And that's not to like add more labor for my child, but it's like also really wonderful to watch my child be a disruptor at almost 2 years old. Like they're really flexing their disruptor muscles. And so it's really fun. And I want to raise a free Black child, right? And so I also want my child to understand how they show up in the world and how they show up within the communities that they care about and are in there, that we're in deep solidarity with. And so I'm really excited to think about some of the suggestions that you've made and how to use this tool to use this tool with our baby. So really excited about that. And my mom's a teacher too, so it's I know that this is like could be really useful for her as well.
So
And I have a picture book coming out, so it could be useful for your baby and others. So
yeah, I love that. I'm
watch
so
the space.
Yes.
Sorry, Frances, go ahead. We got excited.
No, I was going to say from 20-month-old to 20-year-old, I have taught many college courses. And I just think for those of you who haven't seen the book, it's really particularly great for post-secondary and actually high schoolers, because it has it's both educational, but it has a lot of reflections and it has a lot of ways people can journal and think about their roles. And I think that's unique. And I think right now that's really helpful to students because so much is coming at them that it gives them a time to kind of pause and reflect out what they're learning. So really appreciate that about the book. Somebody wrote in a question, and I just wanted to make sure we got to this about what happens when you have a formal job and then, maybe your ecosystem role is not always completely aligned with your either movement job or nonprofit job. How does that work?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. And that does come up a lot. And it's the reality, right? So in many of our spaces, it's hard to play some of the roles that we are aligning with because there's just no room for them. So I think, again, though, to me, it really goes back to what are the shared goals of wherever it is that we are. So, for example, if you're working in an organization that's focused on justice and equity, right, as many of the folks here are, and you want to play the role, say, of a storyteller, because that's something that's aligned with who you are and your skills and experiences, but that's not sort of in your job description, so to speak. I think that it's an opportunity to find guides who have played that role of a storyteller before, and to be kind of coached and mentored into what are a couple of steps I can take to start playing that role at the organization. Could I volunteer to say, can I take a shot at doing XYZ that the organization's doing? Can I try something out, right? Can I collaborate with someone else who has that role that formally to do what I can? So I think that, hopefully you are all part of ecosystems where there is some space to navigate and maneuver, where you could be coached into or mentored into or experiment with some of the roles that you want to play. And as I also say in the book, sometimes we also have to really think hard about whether the ecosystems are right for us, right? I mean, we've all been in situations and in ecosystems that don't, that disappoint us, that just aren't working for us in different ways. And so thinking about how we can be part of ecosystems beyond our work, so to speak, right? So whether it's like a volunteer association, mutual aid, digital organizing, there are a multiplicity of ways in which we can engage in social change, whether it is part of like the day job that we do or outside of it.
Yes, just echoing everything that you've shared just now, and like thinking about some of the most profound experiences for myself of organizing did not come from my day job, right? And of course, you have to have time. That's harder when you're a parent of a 20-month-old. That's harder when you're working multiple jobs, right? There can sometimes be, yeah, just tensions around how we do that. And some of the places where I have been able to show up as my most visionary self, some of the places where I have been able to experiment the most have been in places where I was not paid to do that work, right? Whether that's through a board or through organizing or mutual aid on the weekends or volunteering at night, right? And so there are all these really special and important ways that we show up and do our work in our communities that are outside of our roles at our 9-to-5 jobs. And so that's just really just a helpful reminder, Deepa.
So somebody, we have another question. We'll start winding down in a minute, but there was a question about the resistance of institutions to relationship building, that we're goal-oriented doers and we're not relationship builders. And just, I guess I'm going to ask two questions in one. One, kind of suggestions you have in that, and then just how have your roles changed in institutions to address different aspects or barriers that you face?
You want to go first, Alicia?
Sure, I can start. And that's such a great question. And I think that we've seen it so often. And I think that sometimes that's about who our funders are that are like setting the rules about how experimental or how radical our work can be. Sometimes it's just kind of the nature of capitalism and the nonprofit industrial complex, right? That really sets up these ways in which we are constantly in go mode and less about building relationships with each other within the context of our organization or in the communities that we're a part of or say that we're in solidarity with, right? And so I think that for me, what has been really helpful in getting the organization to slow down is to really focus on what's in the center of the map, right? Which is our shared values. And so I think that as like for folks who are builders, right? Like this is a really great place to kind of bring us back to the core of our work. So just reminding the folks that you're working with in your organization or whatever ecosystem you're referring to, the person who asked the question, right? Like what are our shared values and like which parts of the work are going to get us there? And also what is the urgency, right? Yes, yeah. I ran a rape crisis center. I ran a domestic violence shelter. I get crisis. I get urgency. And also like we would not have survived that work if we weren't in deep relationship with each other. We would not have survived doing such deeply traumatic work as survivors ourselves if we weren't also being caregivers to one another, right? And so I think that like one of the helpful things about this ecosystem, right, is that it also allows us to kind of point to where we show up in the work and then figure out together like what we have going and then like what is missing from the ecosystem. And I think just having a moment of reflection at an in-service, right, at the beginning of a staff meeting to like offer to people like, how are you showing up today? Like what role are you showing up in today is like just enough of a pause to get us to think about what our roles are and how we're doing that in support of one another.
I love that. It doesn't have to be a day-long relationship building. It can be that pause. Love that. So Deepa, maybe you could tell people how they can get the book, give us some practical advice here on those who want to purchase. And people also wanted to know if they could sponsor a book or claim as a sponsor. So I'm just going to fold that into the question.
Yes to all of the above. So I think we're going to put up a slide where we can sort of share how you could use this book. I think we've been talking about that. Alicia just said something about staff meetings. So there are lots of ways you could utilize this, obviously for personal growth and development, but also for organizational strategic planning, for thinking about maybe shifting your programming because you want your organization to play a different role in the coming year. And then even your fundraising would be realigned, based on that, doing community workshops, campaign organization and strategy for your broader ecosystem. So lots of ways in which you can use this in a multidimensional way. And then moving on, how can you kind of access this book? Where can you find it? So the best kind of place, the one place that I would say to go to is socialchangemap.com, and it will lead you to other places as well, like Building Movement Project and Solidarity Is. But this is where you could find links to where you can purchase this guide if you're interested in doing so. It is going to, the publication date when it's widely available is November 30th, but you can pre-order it now wherever you like to find your books. You can also check out a link there called Reach Out, where you can actually reach out and say what you're interested in. So if you want to bring this book to your classroom, and for course adoption, or if you want to have me and Wing T do a training for you on this framework, right? You can fill all that out. We will get back to you in time. And then finally, if you want to join sort of some other of these workshops and trainings, we've got information on that website about upcoming events. So really, that is the one place where you can find the book, reach out to us, and get more information. So I think that is all that we have, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, these are all our handles if you're interested in reaching out to us on Twitter, Instagram. We are in all those places and would love to keep this conversation going.
So before we close and everybody hops off, I'd love to hear a final thought from each of you. Alicia, maybe you could start, and then Deepa, you could end.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so I wrote down that I'm a weaver. I'm an experimenter. I'm often a frontline responder. And thanks to this book and Deepa's guidance and leadership and like support, I think that I might be a visionary too. And I have just been, it's such an honor to like get to like read this book and reflect on my own story and the own shifts and pivots that I've made in my life and within the context of the communities that I care deeply about. And so just want to say thank you, Deepa, for giving us like movement folks who are like deeply concerned with social change, the opportunity to reflect and to use this book as a tool for our movements. What an incredible gift you've given us. So thank you. And I hope you all use it. I hope you use it. It's been so helpful for me. So I hope it's really helpful for other folks too, and just really inspired and grateful for the conversation that we've had in the chat too.
Thank you so much, Alicia. I'm so happy that we launched this book in this way. I can't imagine doing it with anyone else other than Francis and Alicia and my BMP family, and to all of you who came. I think that my last words are really, I just hope that this is helpful. I hope it's a contribution and that it's part of your toolbox to create change in our communities, and look forward to being on that journey with each and every one of you.
So with gratitude to you, Deepa, for doing the book, and to everybody who's attended, I want to thank everybody, and we are done.
Thank you, Francis.
Thanks, friends.